Greetings, students. So today we are going to begin to look at the skeletal system. I want to remind you of this flow map that we kind of started off the nervous system with. You may recall, virtually we didn't do it, but theoretically, imagine a tennis ball was being thrown to you. In order to catch that tennis ball, three things need to happen. One, you have to see it. We need sensory input. Two, you have to think about, what am I going to do? Am I going to catch it? Am I going to dodge it? Am I going to knock it out of the air? What am I going to do? And then three, you need motor output, which means you have to physically move your muscles in order to carry out whatever action you decide to carry out. Previously, we began looking at the nervous system with integration, and we looked at, how does the brain process information? How is that information moved through neurons, through action potentials and neurotransmitters? And then what parts of the brain are involved? Then we backed up a little bit and said, okay, well, how does that information get to the brain in the first place? How does that light energy bounce off the tennis ball, go into your eye, and then how does the eye bring that light energy and into the retina and then convert it into action potentials, which then go to the brain? How does that all work? So now it's time to finish out this flow map and look at this motor output piece. So once the brain has decided I'm going to catch the ball, how is it that the brain is able to, the brain and the bones and the muscles, how do these things all work together to kind of create that movement that's going to let you catch it? So that's what we're going to do. And so this next unit is about bones and muscles. So bones first, and I just want to begin with a brief overview of the different functions of bone, and then we'll look at the different parts of a bone. There's a spogal activity that goes along with this, and if you haven't done that yet, I would recommend doing it before watching this screencast because it kind of introduces you to this in a good way. So different functions of bones. First, it provides shape and support. If you were able to snap your fingers and make your skeleton disappear, this is what would happen to you. So your bone, your muscles, your organs are all kind of suspended on this skeletal system. So it provides support. You have the shape you have because that is the shape of the bones. Second, it protects your organs. So, the skull, for example, its main function really is to protect that brain. If you try to stab through the brain, you can't quite get through there because of this skull in the way. Also, your spinal cord is protected by your vertebrae, your heart and lungs protected by your rib cage. So these really vital organs that you truly cannot live without are quite protected by the skeletal system. The skeletal system also aids in movement. So your muscles work with your bones to generate movement. Here you can see this is the bicep muscle, and when this person bends his arm, what's happening is the muscle is shortening and pulling those bones together. So the bones provide something for the muscles to kind of pull on and shorten it. And that's something we're going to talk a lot more about next unit when we look at muscles. Then it does some more kind of physiologically stuff. A lot of people don't quite realize that the bones actually have living cells inside them. There's this thing called bone marrow in there. We'll look at more in a moment here. But the bone marrow produces blood cells, both red blood cells and white blood cells. So your bones have living cells inside them, and there's some important functions happening there. And then finally, your bones store minerals. So calcium ions, phosphorus, magnesium, all these things that your body needs is stored in the bones. And then when you need them, you kind of pull them off the bones. And if you eat some food and get more of these nutrients, you add them onto the bones. So your bones are these dynamic structures that are continually adding and removing nutrients. So now let's look at the anatomy of a long bone. What is a long bone? So long bone, it's not just like I'm saying, oh, that bone is long. It's actually a term, long bone. And a long bone is basically every bone highlighted in red. These are all long bones, and they all have similar characteristics. One being that they're long, hence the name. So let's take a look at the anatomy of this. Here's a picture of the humerus, which is this upper arm bone here, highlighted in pink. And there's a lot of different parts to this bone. So the first structure is the periosteum. And what this is, you can kind of see it peeling away a little bit here. It's this little papery layer around the bone. It's actually made of connective tissue, and it's continuous with your tendons and ligaments. So that periosteum is really important as a structure involved in allowing your tendons and ligaments to attach to your bones. If you've ever eaten like chicken, sometimes if the bone of a chicken leg, you can kind of start to peel that off a little bit sometimes. I don't know if you've done that or not. It's kind of weird. You have to sort of play with your food. Your parents will yell at you, but you can do it. So that's the periosteum. And then there's a series of structures in what is called the epiphysis. And the epiphysis is this sort of swollen end of the bone. So sometimes we call this the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis for those directional terms we learned about earlier. Other times we just call them the epiphysis. And if we zoom in on that epiphysis, you'll notice that the bone in there, it's got little holes in it. It's porous. Here's another picture of the porous bone. So we call this spongy bone. So the epiphysis is filled with spongy bone, and it's porous. Well, why does it have pores? Well, there's stuff in those pores, and the stuff in those pores is called the red bone marrow. And the red bone marrow contains cells that produce both red and white blood cells. There's kind of a common misconception that since it's red bone marrow, it only produces red blood cells. Not true. It produces both red and white blood cells. So again, living, breathing cells inside the bone. The next region of the bone is the diaphysis, which is this long, elongated central portion of the bone here. And if we zoom in on that, the main thing you're going to see is this big sort of cavity down the middle. It's actually hollowed out. That hollowed area is called the medullary cavity. And the medullary cavity is not empty. It's actually filled with what is called yellow bone marrow. And you can see that here in this picture. And yellow bone marrow basically stores fat. So I don't know if you ever heard that wolves' jaws are strong enough that they can actually crack the bones of their prey. That's pretty cool. It's not just because wolves are awesome, but it's also a functional thing. By cracking the bones of their prey, they can actually access that yellow bone marrow. Which is, fat, which is a really good nutrient source, highly dense. Or maybe if you're a cook, have you ever cooked a soup? A homemade chicken noodle soup, for example. If you want to make an amazing chicken noodle soup, they actually tell you to cook the chicken with the bones in the soup. So you add bones to the soup. And why am I adding bones to the soup? What is this doing? The purpose of the bones, I have an airplane flying over. I don't know if you can hear that. The purpose of putting the bones in your soup is because that fat will then leach out of the bones and into the soup, and it will make a richer, creamier, and more fat-filled, which tastes good, broth. So that's why chefs do that. Now, around the medullary cavity, where that yellow bone marrow is, the bone is much more dense, and so we call this compact bone. And if we zoom in on that dense, compact bone, it looks like this. This is what it would look like through a microscope. So you can see here, remember what that is, the papery layer that you peel off? Go on, what is it? What is it? Did you say periosteum? Hopefully you did. That's the periosteum on the outside. Here you've got spongy bone right here in the kind of in the interior. You can kind of see where that spongy bone is meeting the compact. And then this is the compact. And you can see that it's made of these little circular units. Each of those circular units is called an osteon. And, that's basically just the structure of that compact bone. So we call these the ostia, or singular is osteon, plural ostia. And then inside the osteon are living cells called osteocytes. So every single one of these little hash marks that you see, boom, da boom, da boom, da boom, da boom, that's a little cavity with a cell inside it. And so your bones, it's actually a little bit like a coral reef where you have these living creatures, in the case of coral, living within this kind of hard mineral matrix. For bones, it's living cells embedded within this. Now, if you have living cells in your bone, well, those living cells are going to need oxygen, they're going to need nutrients, they need a blood supply to provide them that. And so we also have what are called central canals, sometimes referred to as Haversian canals, and that is those are these sort of tunnels, so to speak, through the bone, which allow blood vessels to flow through. And the blood is necessary, of course, to keep the osteocytes, those cells, alive. So all that is really at a microscopic level within that compact bone. The next structure is what's called the articular cartilage. The articular cartilage is just this little cap of cartilage, and its job is really just to cushion the bone at the joint. If you ever had a chicken leg and you like maybe get a leg and a thigh connected, if you kind of break those apart, you'll see this kind of white shiny material here. That is the articular cartilage, and that helps the bone kind of smoothly glide like this without bone rubbing against each other. And I guess that's it. So I thought there was one more, but that's going to be coming up later. Not a bad idea to take a moment if you want to just kind of mentally review this and see if you can identify the structure and function of each of these different parts. And if you're going to do that, pause the video, because right about now I'm going to go through the answers. So hit pause and unpause. All right, hopefully you went through these. Number 1 is epiphysis. Number 2 is diaphysis. Number 3 is also the epiphysis. If you want to be really fancy, you could call this the proximal epiphysis because it's closer to the point of attachment. You could call this the distal epiphysis, but just epiphysis is fine as well. Number 4 is the articular cartilage, and that cushions the bone at the joint. 5 is the structure that I didn't quite talk about yet. It's called the epiphyseal plate. We'll get to that in our next screencast. 6 is the type of bone in the epiphysis. That is the spongy bone, and it's spongy, which means it's porous, and that is where the red bone marrow is. 7 is the medullary cavity, and that contains the yellow bone marrow, which stores fat. 8 is the dense compact bone that wraps around that. 9, I believe, is pointing at the yellow bone marrow. The image isn't great there. 10, 11, and 12, let's just not worry about. Those are kind of looking at like the interior of the medullary cavity and things like that, so we won't worry about those. But that's it. So hopefully that helps complement what you did with the Spogle, and a lot of this is just memorization, so just kind of take some time to review it, practice it, and lock it in. Thanks.